Welcome to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swindon Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, do people exist? Tim.
This might sound like an odd title, but let me explain. It's been a well-known problem that people change their physical content of their bodies. Well-known fact that people change their physical content of their bodies every 5 years or so. This means on a physical level, the person I am is not the person I was 5 years ago in terms of purely physical matter. So if you look at a picture of yourself from 5 years ago, almost every single atom is been replaced or rebuilt. It's a ship of Theseus problem in a certain way. So if someone is in jail, and this is the sort of point I'm driving at. If someone is in jail for a crime they did 5 years ago, that body, if you just count the physical atoms, didn't commit that crime. If you signed a contract or made a vow 5 or 10 years ago, you, as in your physical body, didn't sign that. Hence, on a purely physical level, we humans as individuals don't exist in continuity over time. This is, to some extent, the ship of Theseus problem exists literally for each person on a physical level. Moving on to political thinking, libertarians as well as Marxists, two of the more sophisticated and at times warring dissident intellectual groups, will make the point of labor theory value. Yes, libertarians will talk about subjective theory value, but Adam Smith will talk about labor theory value, and so will the Marxists. And the idea is that labor, which is our bodies, not abstract capital, should be the root of value. So the reason why we own goods or whatever is we mix our labor with the things or artifacts or land. So this is something libertarians like Hans Hoppe will say, that people own their own body. So in this regard, ownership seems straightforward and relevant for not only Marxists and libertarians, but also classical liberals, of course. So hence, we own our own bodies. This shows up in the abortion debates too. People have a right to own the body, or the fetus has a right to own the body. And third, on a theological, philosophical level, as well as a practical level too, not just that, when we talk to people, we are talking to them as if they are solid in time. So I've known you now we did this podcast at least 5 years, but as we started in 2020, to some extent, are different people than we are in 2026 now. And people talk as this way all the time. We'll say, well, I was a different person 6 years ago, or I was a different person 20 years ago. For thinkers like Wittgenstein, for example, we will often say, well, there's the later Wittgenstein and the early Wittgenstein, almost describing as if there's two people. People will say this about Hans Hoppe too. Hans Hoppe, the early Rothbard, and the later Rothbard. Are there two different Rothbards? Or is there one Rothbard with one body and differing thought systems or changing opinions? And for certain animals, if you look in full biology, such as tadpoles or caterpillars, they literally change as they age, as they go through their different life cycles. They change their whole physical body. So that's one thing. That's one thing I think is worth thinking about on the philosophical levels. And Kinsella, who not a direct friend of the show, but you somewhat have had some interactions with him. He's a big guy on criticizing intellectual property, and I am too. I don't like intellectual property, but I think one of the problems, and I don't mean to point out mistakes for the enemy, is that if you're going to just say you only own physical things, so therefore you can't own intellectual property, that's fine. But then the question is, am I a physical thing if I change every 5 years? The only thing Tim Patton, the entity, exists as a kind of intellectual property, which is unified or Swithin Dobson, or it's in a sense like an intellectual property. Because you 20 years ago are different than you now, or different than you tomorrow or 5 years from now. So I think that's one of the things that the anti-IP people should think about regarding intellectual property. Because one of the ways to think about people is to think about people as a kind of idea. And that idea has rights. And in actual practice, that's in a way what we do. because we do change. We do have different viewpoints in our lives, and this stuff is just straightforward, obvious. I mean, people change their viewpoints. Some people, in the extreme cases, have, and this gets into our mental illness discussions, will have multiple personalities. But even if you don't want to go that far, you could just say, well, I have different masks wear for different people, or I have different things at different stages of life. And this question of whether people exist also matters. When does life begin? I sort of mentioned that. Now I'm extremely heterodox on this question. I hold views which does piss off lots of different people. I mean, part of the issue to me is I don't see young children, nor do I see, let alone fetus, nor do I see handicapped people as truly people. Now, this will say, well, you're being a bigot or you're being a monster. And it's like, well, I mean, if you really like you do treat people who are not abled as differently than people who are abled. Like if I throw a baseball at an infant or an elderly person, they will get hit in the face. If I throw them at my brother or my nephew, they would catch it. So, and there's plenty of other circumstances. That's a small one. And so, like, law treats people with different abilities differently, in general. Not always, but typically it does. So, and my final angle to attack this problem is again the theological level. I mean, good theologians will claim that humility and selflessness is a virtue. One should do God's will, not my will. This seems to suggest that humans' will is basically evil. So if you think about what is the intellectual property or idea or thing that is the essence of Tim Patton, you say, well, if my soul, if you go full Augustine, Aquinas, Calvinist type, well, my will, the central part that unifies me is evil. And if you take this sort of Brian Davies type, David Orenberg type argument that evil in some sense doesn't exist, this is another roundabout way of saying I don't exist. I mean, if the only relevant decisions I make are decisions which the highest power, if you think that way, thinks is evil, then do I even exist in that sense? So I think there's a number of levels this conversation could go, and there's a number of levels this works. So that's my starting comment here. On a physical level, we don't exist. What do you make of this argument, Swithin? What do you make of this discussion? Like, do you think about this? Are you the same person you were 5 years or 20 years ago? What do you think of this?
It's an interesting topic. You're certainly right that you can't simply make the assertion that we are the same because we have the same physical matter, because clearly we don't. Another way of trying to make the argument as to how you would have a continuous sort of existence over time is kind of memory and consciousness, which I believe John Locke held from memory. The problem with that is if you ever go to sleep, are you human? Because you're not conscious or you have no awareness of yourself. It's like, okay, maybe not. Memory is interesting to say small children. The radical animal rights guy who justifies infanticide in certain circumstances, Australian guy, I can't remember his name, utilitarian Australian guy, basically makes a case that to be human, you have to have a memory of yourself. And if you don't have a memory of yourself, yes, Peter Singer, that's the guy, yeah. You have to be human, you have to have a memory of yourself, and small infants don't have a memory of themselves, therefore they're not human. So infanticide is justifiable in certain circumstances. Now, he says it's generally bad because the parents would be upset and stuff because he's a utilitarian. But if the parents thought it was a good idea and they didn't really know anybody, then cool, infanticide, do it, fine. So the continuous and memory of yourself just seems to, just everyday people that you think you might want to say are the same person are not, because they don't have a continuous conscious experience because they sleep. So that would sort of undercut the usefulness of that kind of line of argument. Now, of course, you could just say you don't exist over time and there's a different self. The semantics of that, though, is weird because it is true in one sense that I am not the same person I was 20 years ago. But I'm still using the word I, which implies some form of continuity. between myself in the past and myself today. Otherwise, I don't know how you would. I don't know how you can talk about yourself being a different person in the past than you are today in such a way that didn't imply that there was some form of continuity. I just don't know how you would phrase it, sort of like semantically, because it would seem to be incoherent. So the question is, how then can we understand people to be the same over time? And as an aside, you have brought out some interesting political theory relations, which tend not to be joined in this context. Generally speaking, this is just sort of I don't know, something like mereology, theory of parts, or it's sort of like just philosophical psychology or something like that, and it doesn't tend to be linked to political philosophy. But it is exactly true that there's political philosophy is based on some prior concepts which are generally just taken to be true for the sake of argument and not really interrogated. So for me, I think there seems to be two plausible options, I would say, that would explain how you are persistently the same person over time. One is to take some sort of dualism in that, well, okay, fine, there is this matter that changes over time, but there's this immaterial aspect which persists, and so it's that immaterial thing which is you, and then that's just you is instantiated in a different way over time. The other approach is to use a version of Aristotle's concept of souls. Now, soul, you might think, well, isn't that what I was just talking about? But not for Aristotle. Aristotle referred to sort of vegetable, animal, and also rational souls. And the soul is just sort of like the organizing principle of the thing that it is. So it's linked very much to sort of like the formal and final cause. That is the thing that makes the organizing principle of what it is, which is the formal cause, and that's then clearly related to what it does and what the way in which that thing is directed. So if you look at a seed, for instance, you can see in this internal biology, it's directed towards being a tree, for instance. And insofar as the formal cause remains the same, then you could say it persists through time. So a tree is a tree or has treeness, as it were, insofar as it's directed, like a seed or whatever, is direct. The individual thing is directed towards its final goal of becoming a tree with lots of leaves, for instance. If it was to that organizational center was to die, was to be degraded in such a way that it would be no longer directed in that manner, then it would cease to be what it was. So a tree that's chopped down then clearly is no longer a tree in the same sense, and it has discontinuity. There's a clear demarcation of discontinuity. There is an old article which I can't find, which I did think of reading before, but I couldn't find it, about how there was evidence from biology of, like, it was a worm that was like degraded massively and didn't demonstrate the typical features of wormness, or it was some insect thing, but the way in which it was acting, it was clearly following a plan, as it were, of the thing that it was directed towards. It seemed to have the same organizing principle. That would be the best explanation of why it was behaving in the manner that it was. I can't remember the details, unfortunately. Now you could say that, well, actually matter doesn't have space for even vegetable and animal souls, and so you could argue they're immaterial as well. That would be if you were somebody who took sort of like a post-Newtonian view of matter, and so like formal and final causes don't really exist in things. But either way, that would be a way of explaining why you could be the same person in some sense, and I do think you need this some sense, and clearly from human experience that we have this sense that there is this continuity. I think it also explains the behavior of things, that it is the same thing in some sense. And even when we try to say that we are a different person than we were before. We presuppose that there is some continuity because there is the I. So that would be my general approach to the question. No, I do think that things like memory and things are important, because clearly people with dementia and whatever aren't the same person, and they're sort of somehow less than themselves. And the flourishing human, sort of the archetypal human, would seem to have at least decent memory of his past, to be able to narrate a coherent story of his own life, which actually relates to some theories of meaning and things. Because, yeah, if you didn't consider yourself the same over time, then considering meaning in the universe would be quite difficult, because you wouldn't be able to have a consistent story with yourself within it. So those are sort of my overall sort of intro thoughts to the question.
I think you made the comment that I brought in some political philosophy, which isn't normally attached to this, and I did that somewhat purposely, because this is oftentimes viewed as like a high in the sky, useless intellectual debate. And I think it has quote unquote real world consequences. If you think of ideas as being 500 years behind their implementation, in reality, you could think about, it took. We sort of have a Lockean society in some ways. Yes, we have corporate capitalism and all this other stuff, but in many ways, in straightforward ways, we argue in Lockean terms. The Marxists argue in this way. We argue in this way. We're sort of disputing over it. But Locke was alive 500 years ago. It took 5 centuries for the Christians to really get their, implemented in some ways. And you can argue, well, they didn't actually implement it or implemented poorly or whatever. But so if you think about this, like if we think about ourselves as like physical, I think there's a huge problem in just thinking ourselves as physical, because, as I stated, straightforwardly, we don't exist as single physical identity. Like, think about a covered bridge. There's a covered bridge. There's a lot of them in where I'm from, and one of them was not only was destroyed by a hurricane, somewhat destroyed, but they somewhat rebuilt it. And I forget what percentage of it was quote unquote original. And this is a wood structure, and wood can last a long time, but not in certain ways it can't. So, like, if you look at that covered bridge, is it the same covered bridge that was built in 1880 or 1850? And the answer is not really. So if we think about people, my grandmother lived to 100. There's a very real way in which that person is just somewhat different now than they were. So semantically, that's something I never thought about. I am a different person than I was X years ago. X number of years ago? How do you say that without forming a obviously contradictory sentence? I mean, this is one of the problems of language, in a sense. Can you render statements that are hard? How do you render statements in such a way? So my question for you, Swarthen, is, and you sort of hinted toward an answer with your discussion on aerosol, is, do we need a physical identity to tie people down? It's something Richard Swinburne, the open theist, would say about bodies, that we need bodies to tie ourselves down. I mean, this is one of the, again, you can be a straight atheist if you want. It doesn't bother me. But, like, this is one of the problems that Swinburne points out about, like, angels and other entities, is they don't have bodies that they can manifest in them. So it seems like our most important thing, I forget if it was Ed Fazer were talking about this, but it seems like in practice, our bodies, we're like, if you treat the soul is like and I think this is the literal terminology of Fazer. I'm not sure if Fazer was criticizing the soul is the pilot of the ship. So if you think about a ship or an airplane, whatever, when the pilot of the ship turns the ship to the left, it's the pilot is in his mind turning the ship to the left, but like physically the rudders are moving, and so forth. There's a bunch of physical processes, but it's the pilot in the ship is deciding where to go. That's the entity that's making decisions. You don't look at the rudder to explain where the ship is going. Now, I mean, you can look at in a post hoc way. You can look at it, if you're looking at a distance, but the actual decision making is occurred at pilot. So my issue with the way of souls are used is it turns the bodies just into extension of the will. And one of the ways this breaks down, and this is one of my problems with, like, the fetus debates, and the abortion debates, and some of the ableist debates, is that like if I get physically injured, and my legs no longer work, there's a certain way in which my will is frustrated by my legs either not being there, they were amputated, or they don't work, they're defective. This is the same problem with sex organs too. Like if they've never worked or they don't work as such, there's a certain way in which your mind treats them as working, but they don't work. And same way with other things, like and there are also just competence differentials between people. If someone is not good at math, in some sense their will is frustrated. Why don't they know this stuff? And this somewhat gets into Socrates' problem of learning in the Meno dialogue. That's the other part. That's the part I don't always focus on, but that's another part of Socrates' Meno dialogue. How do we learn things? And Socrates brings up a slave, and they try to explain this is one of the counter examples they try to bring up Socrates. Socrates uses a slave, and this slave was quote unquote ignorant, and they show him teaching him something. So how did he learn that? So one of my problems with the soul is it just seems like our bodies just become kind of pointless extensions until they're not, of course. Until they're not. I mean, if we do get injured or we do get frail, then they become a problem. But what do you make of soul? I would call this soulism. Like, doesn't this just reduce our bodies to that of the ship's pilot, to use the Ed Phaser example? Like, do we need a body or some sort of non-physical identity to quote unquote tie people down? Strict sense, Microsoft or Apple doesn't exist. It's just a million subcontractors and groups. But we refer to Apple computers or the U.S. government or things like that. Is it is our body just a giant corporation in a sense? Like, what would you make of this line of what would be the errors of soulism? Or if you don't think there are, it's within. What do you think of this?
So just to clarify, you're saying that soulism means that the body is irrelevant. Is that, and just to clarify, what precisely do you mean by soulism as such? That there is some sort of immaterial aspect or to the body that is directing it? How
does the soul reduce the body? If you treat the soul or the will as the primary thing that is you, is the body just Is the body just an extension of you in the same way that the ship is an extension of the ship's captain? If you want to figure out where the ship's going, or where you don't look at the rudders. You don't look at. You mean it defines the limits and limitations of obviously a faster plane or ship will go faster or whatever, but the actual direction is defined entirely internally. Wouldn't you say that is the case? But there's also there's some people who aren't as quick as thinking. There's some people who aren't as how does that relationship quote unquote cash out?
So are you saying that? So what sounds like is you're saying that maybe you have a soul which is sort of has equal capacity in everybody, but somehow the physical matter in which the soul is instantiated gives different limits to different people. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, that's a good way.
I mean, I suppose that's possible, but I don't see. I don't know why that'd be a huge issue. But just to go back to another thing, so the pilot of the ship, you could make the case that I think the phaser one was probably him dealing with Cartesian dualism, because under that view, it does seem there's a very extrinsic relationship between the matter that is physically composes of you and the immaterial aspect. It's almost as if you could just dump in the soul anywhere and it wouldn't really matter. The view,
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, could you upload yourself to just like an iPhone? I mean, again, some people would get cringe at this idea, but if you just existed as an iPhone, in some weird sense, you could still exist in many ways. I mean, this might be science fiction in some ways, but it's sort of like a weird way in which people actually do think about humans now. Humans are just, a big computer, right?
Yeah. It's They do. I mean, and under that view, yeah. I mean, if you are just a soul, then the material doesn't matter. Um, the view of Aristotle, as I understand it, and sort of Thomists in general, is that the soul, well, as I mentioned before, so the animal soul and the vegetable soul under Aristotelian physics, or metaphysics, biology, I'm not sure which, need not be immaterial. It's just that is the organizing principle, and there are various sort of qualitatively different types of organizational principle. So the animal soul has like has locomotive function in a way that the vegetable soul doesn't. Now, the Thomists are very controversial to Aristotle as to whether the rational soul requires it to be immaterial. Phaser argues it's immaterial, but for pure continuation of a thing, you could even just say that humans just have an animal soul, and that would still account for them being the same thing through time. And that wouldn't even, at least under that view, wouldn't need any reference to an immaterial soul, unless, of course, you thought that even the vegetable and animal souls required it some form of immateriality. And remember, even though they use the term soul, it just means organizational principle, and a different form of organizational principle, which is directly instantiated in the physical, as I understand it. So I do think it would be a problem, given the way we look at things, to say that it's just you could sort of put a soul or a rational soul, an immaterial soul, into anything. That would seem to be contrary to everything we know about the physical world and what we know about matter in general. And it would also then create a very extrinsic relationship between the immaterial mind and the body, because, as you said, you could just upload your consciousness to the cloud or something like that, which would then just be just, well, it is bizarre, and there's other arguments against it, but it seems at least counterintuitive in the to a large degree. So I do think if it's the case that there is just the soul, I think the problem is you just get this weird extrinsic relationship between the body and the mind, which is, I say, I don't think there's just justice to what we understand in the material world in general.
I guess one solution for me, and this is somewhat the heart of the episode, is just to say, well, common sense language is actually false, and we don't actually exist physically over time. So in the same way we say, well, since the U.S. Capitol or the White House burned down, or a building burned down and was rebuilt, then in some sense, each time they add a new timber, or each time they coat the paint, or each time they redo the foundation roof, the White House or whatever building you have doesn't exist. You might say, well, there's an idea of the White House and that exists, but that in itself doesn't exist as a physical entity through time, especially as a kind of like organic artifact. By organic, mean that at one point the trees were alive, and then it's an artifact since it was generated by humans. That organic artifacts change over time, or like you might say, well, you could also say, well, Mississippi River has changed its course. I presume other rivers have changed their course too. And it's been pointed out that the Mississippi River, the only reason it still flows to New Orleans is in 1970, there was a major flood. And thanks to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers having a giant repository area, they actually saved New Orleans by, because the Red River, the Mississippi would naturally, quote unquote, flow to where the Red River is currently if in the 1970s, if they didn't build a giant structure to divert it, to keep it flowing out to where it is currently. So I bring that up as an example just because you could say, well, that is now a human artifact in some sense, the course of the Mississippi River. And that's an example that, like, French explorers would point out that, like, in the 1500s, it used to flow into different spots. So when we refer to an entity like the Mississippi River, what we're really referring to is this ever-changing thing. And again, I don't want to sound like a flaky Buddhist here, but that's just sort of like how it seems that physical reality looks. So I guess one solution is say commonsensical language is false. We don't actually, many physical objects don't actually exist in continuity through time, um, in a way that the person I was 10 years ago is not the person I am 10. Now you could say, well, I have a lot of similarities with the person I was a day ago, 2 days ago, a year ago, mostly 2 years ago, somewhat, 3 years ago, so less so. And in a way, now you might say, well, I'm using the word I, but to make that sentence, so Hans Hoppe might say that's a performative contradiction, but still, it still makes sense in some level what I'm saying. And actually, in practice, we do quote unquote change. The White House or the Mississippi River does change, yet we still refer to the same thing. So that's just one way to bite the bullet and just say, for a strictly materialist. But I'm not 100% comfortable doing that. But I do think this has implications for the legal and political world, in the sense that a lot of these debates about ownership, which again, it's a libertarian like hobby horse, which of course, as we pointed out on our crazy horse episode, the Marxists still implicitly buy in, is that like we as persons are a central unit in post-Lockean, post-Protestant Western philosophy. And since the West, quote unquote, conquered the world, everyone in some sense thinks that way. We think of ourselves as individuals, and that's how we sort of operate in quote unquote society. We don't operate as a unit. And this goes back to Hans Hoppe's like common sense examples. Like, well, we don't. I don't control your body. I don't control President Trump's body. Like if there was a creature that could control all bodies and manipulate ourselves, then actually that creature would be quote unquote in charge, not us, not me. So that's one of the reasons why I kind of wanted to have this discussion. I don't think we're going to make quote unquote headway in this conversation. I just wanted to sort of highlight what I viewed as the issues of whether people existing. And I will say, just because common sense language says things are such a way, doesn't necessarily mean it is in the highest level true. I mean, this goes back to the Walter Block, Brian Kaplan debate on work. Walter Block was holding weights out in the side, and he asked Brian Kaplan, "Or am I doing work?" By the physics definition, and Brian Kaplan's answer, I think, to me is legendary: yes and no. By the physics definition, yes. No, you're not doing work because you're holding still. But by the practical sense, if you're holding up weights, you're doing work by expending energy. Now you get into the weeds of that conversation, but I do think just because commonsensical grammar says things are the way doesn't mean that's necessarily the way. So those are if you have other lines of inquiries with them, I'd be glad to facilitate them. But do you have anything else to say?
I think you should make a distinction. I mean, the flowing of the rivers are interesting, but let's take something relatively more seemingly different. When you talk about the White House being different and bridges and stuff, that they're artifacts. I mean, they're made of, there's no intrinsic organizational principle behind them. The organizational principle is sort of imposed on top of it because it's an artifact. And the only way we can say whether it's working well or not is reference to basically the human plan. There's no sort of internal plan in the same way. Now, there may be internal plans, as it were, within the materials that make it up, say the wood or the stone or whatever, but there's no internal organizational principle that makes the White House the White House, in the same way that there is an internal principle within the biology of a dog which sort of directs it towards a particular form of dogness, as it were. So I think, yeah, I mean, the flowing rivers is interesting, but I think it clear and obvious that there is a clear difference between artifacts and sort of certain natural objects or substantial forms, which show them to be qualitatively different. So to say that we don't know when is it the same White House as it used to be, or is it a different White House? We can specify the parameters of what will count as the original and then see, to what extent it's different. Whereas with the dog, as it were, well, as long as the organizing principle of its sort of biology towards the goal of being a healthy sort of dog persists, then since that comes into existence until it goes out of existence, it is one and the same dog. And I think that has the advantage that we can posit everything we want to posit about humans or animals, about the knowledge of them, or humans in particular, knowledge of themselves, other things like that. We can say all of that. We can say that we are different in certain respects, but we still have that continuity that we are the same thing. We're not just irrational. The consciousnesses aren't just sort of stop-start. There's this sense of continuity. Also, one thing as well, actually, you mentioned political philosophy in this view of the self. It actually also impacts literature, film, and story in general. I was interested. I asked AI this, and this was actually confirmed by a guy I know who's sort of big into literature and stuff, that there's, in critical circles, there's a disdain for plot. Plot is considered vulgar. And really, where it's all about is about character and theme. And so plot's basically irrelevant. And I asked DeepSeek AI about this, and he said this really came into the fore in sort of like the 18th and 19th centuries, where the focus was on the internal psychology of the character, and that really the stories that we tell ourselves don't really exist in the world, they're just imposed. And all there is this fragmentary consciousness. And there isn't really a straight sort of conscious experience anyone has. It's all fragmentary and strange. And this is really what literature should be about through this sort of artistic form, showing us what the truth of the world really is, which is this sort of, I say, this fragmentary elements of consciousness. There's no real continuity of things, and so these plot things they're just sort of made up. They're fictions, in fiction in the bad sense in this context, which I hadn't thought about until we started talking. But I thought that's also a relevant relevant factor.
Do you think plot is vulgar? Like we not notoriously, but we disagree oftentimes about what makes a good movie. And you actually have a good theory of what makes a good movie. It's like a movie we both like is the lives of others. So I think I like movies for their themes and ideas, but you like movies, I think, more for their tight plots. So like, do you yourself, not what others, think that plots are central? And also, do you think that is the case? Do you think there is some sort of grand, quote unquote, meta narrative that we all see? I mean, this showed up in our news episode where I was somewhat, like you said, is there a market for news or is there a market for truth? And I was like, well, like in some sense, I am a bit of a postmodernist, and I do think like Venezuelans and Ukrainians, whether I'm not sure what the root is, but like they do see things differently than per se Americans. Now maybe colors or differently or whatever. You might be able to push me to an area where we all agree on this, maybe. But on complex topics, we do see things differently. What do you make of that discussion? You brought it up.
So with this
good thing.
Yes, yeah. So is there a meta narrative? I mean, that's interesting. I think, well, I would defend the Christian meta narrative, and because as an aside, interestingly, I think Christianity, anything over and above anything else, is a story. It is creation, fall, redemption, restoration. I mean, that is it. More than philosophy, it is a narrative, really. Now, I think that now you can tell different stories to explain this, but it does seem to be the case that humans have a sense of things at some point were good and somehow they went bad. And depending on whether you consider them basically optimistic or pessimistic, this will either get better in the future or at the end, what counts as the end, or it won't. but the idea that somehow creation was good in a way, but or reality or nature, creation is loaded in certain respects, or so is nature in some sense, and it's sort of marred. I think that sense is true. I think that's sort of like universal, really. I mean, I think it's even consistent with sort of like Buddhism as well, even if it thinks of reality as illusory in certain respects. That, but because the idea, you want to get back to the one type thing. So I think that element of marred goodness, that it was good and then it wasn't, I think seems to be ingrained in human psychology. I'm open to counterexamples. I haven't thought about it.
Again, this might be just Schopenhauer, or this might just be Western Buddhism. So actual Buddhists might say this is not the case. But like, from my understanding, the goal of it is to get rid of yourself. The reason you meditate, you want to meditate about nothing. Now, again, people will probably explain this in a way that's not about this. But from my understanding, that's what the goal is, which means to suggest that the self, in some sense, is quote unquote evil or quote unquote rotten or ill-begotten in some sense. So, like, I mean, again, it's funny enough, maybe I just see Calvinism everywhere, but I see a deep similarity between like that, the practical goal of Buddhism, and if you think about sophisticated philosophy of Calvinism, I see a deep, like, well, the person is bad. If you think about the metaphysics of the good and evil, then when do I even exist? I don't know. It's hard to say. Like so when you think about movie examples, which I think are interesting, I think movies are interesting in the sense that it allows us to think about reality. I do think that I do like movies that are theme heavy because I think, weird, but I think the theme is more important than the various plot structures, the various quote unquote plot points that come about. So like maybe I do like quote unquote new fiction, but I can be persuaded otherwise. I mean, what is it about plot that you think is central? And I don't mean to distract too much from our opening topic of do people exist, but I do think it's related in the sense that people think of themselves as a story, and that seems to be the way we view ourselves, and that's a commonsensical way in some ways to think of ourselves. But people do quote unquote change their stories about themselves. People have midlife crises. People get bitter. Things happen too. Now you can say, well, that's still a kind of story. But I'm sort of running out of things to say here, Swithin. I don't have too much more to say. But if you have more to say, please do.
Just to backtrack on the Buddhism thing, I was talking about the Buddhism thing insofar as the world is not how it ought to be. There was a time when it was good and a time that it became bad. Why
would you say it came bad then? Why did it?
Well, I don't know. Again, well, I mean, on the Buddhist view, I'm far from an expert. I mean, maybe the concept of the self arose in separation of everything else, and that's the problem. All I was saying was the general concept of goodness, the world being good and then being bad. So, I mean, under some evolutionary psychology, they'll make the case that, oh, well, this was you remembering the hunter-gathering time or something, and that's kind of the golden age, and then it's kind of sort of, I can't remember the exact reasoning as to why the hunter-gathering phase is supposed to be sort of like the golden age, as it were. But that was all I was meaning with that.
I would just say the question of why it fell is like, to me, the question. And if it fell because of our agency or our ancestors' agencies, then and to some extent we are an extension of our ancestors, then in some sense it's our fault. TLDR, it's our fault. And one of the ways that I recently, because I'm not from a huge family, but I'm from a bigger family than most. I have a lot of nieces and nephews. One of the weird ways that I see things that parents don't see is because I get variety of different children from different parents, is I notice children as an extension of their parents in a way that their parents don't always recognize it. So like I mean, again, this is actually a very old way of thinking about having children, but I see this as an uncle. I see, like, I can see, well, she is just playing games the same way her mother would play games, aka my sister. I mean, again, and in a weird way, I think, well, from a genetic biological point, it makes sense. It makes sense that to some extent the quote unquote code is the same. The environment is, from an environmental point, the environment is the same. Sometimes parents, because they are embedded in that whole framework, don't always see it as much. But you could see it in extended family much better if you knew the previous nodes. And people say, well, you're acting like your grandfather or something like that. But which then again makes me question of like, well, you know, am I just a weird extension of previous generations of myself, or different iterations? So like if you think about software, you know, you have Google Chrome or the Apple iPhone 10 and the Apple iPhone 6, so to speak. They're all iPhones. They're just have different versions of them, you know, or the Boeing 737. They have different versions or models. Like, is this a way to think about people? Like one of my issues with the DNA thinking is if you look back in time, and this gets to our sort of our abortion discussion, fetus discussion. Like there's a very real way in which, like, the idea of me was floating about before I existed in some sense than wouldn't you say? Do you see that in your
the idea,
family?
okay. Well, maybe the idea, but as I said, if you take the physical instantiation of the physical instantiation of the form to which the body is directed, you know, the organizing principle didn't exist until you had the fertilized egg, at which point the organized principle exists, at which point the human exists.
What percentage of your own personality or essence would you say is quote unquote yours? 90%, 99%, 10%? If I'm being honest, I don't know.
I don't know what it means. I don't know what it would mean to say anything less than 100% was mine. In what way could it not be mine?
So I guess this is the intersection between individualism versus like your environment and biology. So like if you're quote unquote good at something, I had an argument with Gemini, the Google's AI, which I had access to for free for a while, the most advanced version. You could just ask infinite amount of questions about it. And you know, one of the things that Gemini, the AI, responded, well, because it got like, I made the point, like if you're good at something, let's say you're good at math, and your father was also good at math, and your grandfather is good at math. Is it really the case that you're good at math, or is that just this certain set of genes is good at math? So you think about a car. If you have a fast car, well, a fast car has these swoped characteristics. You really would say these swoped characteristics are good. Now you could say, well, that car is fast. You're good at math. You are the rightful owner of it. Blah blah blah. On a practical sense, I agree. But if you get away from the commonsensical example, then I'm less sure. Like so, like obviously, people who are really good at a certain form of sport have a huge genetic component to it. No one like denies that. I mean, oddly enough, I deny that the least. I think you'd be the same way.
Yeah. No, and I agree. But I mean, even if what I would say is, even if it's environmental, it's genetic, it's still yours. I mean, you could talk about to what extent you have responsibility for you is another. I think that's really the question you're asking. To what extent do I have responsibility for what I am and how I am? I think that's the question you're asking. But just to circle back, you asked me about story and about plot because I thought that was interesting. It seems to me that story, is plot, as in action is story. It's hard to.
I agree. It's hard to tell the difference apart. This is something I always did poorly in like high school literature. I don't know. Is that part of the plot or is that part of the character development? It seems like they're the same thing.
Well, what I would say is to what extent it's unified, because what you tend to have is, so for instance, I'm rewatching Battlestar Galactica, minus lots of bad episodes because I know which ones they are, and I know which ones are essential for the overall plot. So there's the overall plot, which is a setup of that is the Cylons attack Caprica, and then the remnants of the human race are surviving and going through space, and the Cylons are trying to kill them. And that's the main plot. But then there's backstory of various characters. And there's one episode which I've just avoided watching, which is terrible, about the backstory about one of the characters who had a relationship with the brother of somebody else, and she had involved somehow with his death, and it's all sad and stuff. And it was like, this has nothing to do with Cylons. I watched this because we care about the Cylons. Now, what I want is the characters to be linked into that directly. So, I mean, there's one character who is Gaius Baltar, who was responsible indirectly for the Cylons destroying all the humans on Earth because he let a Cylon woman in who he didn't realize was a Cylon. But almost everything he does, at least to begin with, is related to the overall plot. So I think of sort of the plot and the character, when they're good, is they're unified in the appropriate sense. When it's just character, that's where it becomes a problem. So really what it ought to be is ideally one entirely unified thing of plot, character, and story. But then you can highlight various aspects and analyze it in a certain way, but it's unified. So in the same way, like a dish for food is entirely unified as one, but you can analyze the individual elements, but they all work together. That's really what you should be aiming for.
If someone consistently bakes a cake, okay, over, like, it's hard to say this, but if you bake 10 chocolate cakes with the same recipe, obviously each chocolate cake is going to have different physical ingredients. Do you think you have the same chocolate cake? Yes or no? This is like a Walter Block, Brian Kaplan kind of question. Do you have the same cake?
You have the same type of cake, but you don't have the same cake. So you would have sort of like the idea. There is a sense in which there's the idea of that particular cake, and these are just manifestations of the cake, which will be slightly different in some. I mean, the density will be ever so slightly different, the size will be ever so slightly different. They'll be using different flour. It's that flour, not this flour, because it's in different boxes. So I think you need now exactly how you cash this out. You need an idea of a type and the manifestation of the type. I think is the way that you would seem to be the best way of dividing that up.
Do you think it's unreasonable to think of yourself as, in the same way that there are a lot of different types of cakes and you can mix certain things together? Do you think it's unreasonable to think of yourself in that manner compared to other humans? Do you think that's like an unreasonable metaphor?
What, that humans are kind of all like ingredients of cakes and they can be made in different cakes, but they're still cakes, so they're still human?
Yes.
Except that there seems to be a difference of ingredients as well. There's not just generic ingredients for humans. It seems like this is going to sound very eugenicist, but there's various quality of ingredient for humans, and different ingredients will produce different humans. So, well, maybe that was what you were meaning, but
yeah, sure.
There are different quality and type of ingredient which still makes human, and so in that sense, it's more diverse than the cake example.
So, like, one of the problems I have with Ed Feser, or the soul-only people, the soul is, and you can call this dualism, but if you really interrogate dualists, they really think the soul is the most important thing. They think the flesh is either at best neutral, if at worst diversionary. It's a thing that bogs us down. So like, one of my problems is, and people have done, again, you can always disagree on studies, but like judges people do better on tests if they're well fed, for example. And by well fed, I mean if they have vitamins, if they have certain macronutrients and so forth. People talk about brain fog if they eat too much sugar or too much processed food. Which, like, if the soul is the main driver of our lives, then in a very real sense, that would seem problematic to say that. Like, I suffer, quote unquote, from headaches, which to me are a weird entity in the sense that if you looked at me physically, I look fine. But sometimes it's like they're, quote unquote, debilitating in a weird sense. I mean, I once had to, when I was cycling in the Andes, I got a really bad altitude sickness. I had to lay down on multiple occasions for a day and a half. I mean, now physically then I might have actually had something wrong with me. But if you just did a scan of me, I looked fine. And when I'm at sea level, all these things look fine. I get headaches at sea level. So that's like a thing that doesn't exist in a physical sense, in a normal way we think about physical things. And when we say, well, the computer's not working, it's very rarely the computer is not working because the physical components are broken. Something is screwed up about the software, or something is screwed up about the way the software is arranged, or something like that. Now that's not true for cars. Well, actually, it will start increasingly be true for cars. Besides, cars have a lot of software in them. But I like, when I go back to the question, which I somewhat forgot. I can't help but think that the example of the soul only misses all the physical aspects, and the materialist misses all the non-physical aspects. And again, maybe this forces me into a position which I don't like, which is some sort of middle position, a muddled middle position. But like I quote unquote struggle with the way to think about the physical aspects and the non-physical aspects, which it seems like the only way we can speak to people is as if they exist in time in some ways, and other ways we don't. We recognize that people can change. So that is my, to some extent, concluding comment here. I don't see a clear. This is one area where I don't see any clear philosophy, which is even extremists to clearly like latch onto. So like clearly physical only comes with problems, and soul or non-physical only comes with problems. There's also the interaction problems. And there's also the political problems of how does this cash out? I mean, I for years have thought that, like ever since I heard about this physical fact that we changed like all sorts of punishments and contracts and labor theory of value. This is all dependent on some sort of continuous existing person, which doesn't always, people have days where they will say, well, at 18, he's now a legal person, or 16. And this is Walter Block's ad nauseum continuum problem. But yeah, those are my concluding comments. I think it's an interesting topic, but I just don't think there's any clear-cut answers. I know some people will say, well, I have a clear-cut answer. It's this. It's like, well, what about all these things? So thanks for doing the episode, Swithin. I mean, it's almost at an hour, so I do think this is my final comment. But if you have any more final comments, please do.
What I would say is, as I understand it, your criticism of soulism would apply to Cartesian dualism primarily. It does seem to me that the sort of Aristotelian Thomist one, where I think the big problem, for instance, with the mind and the body isn't really the interaction problem. That just seems straightforward. Like, why can't there be basic interaction between the mind and the body? I mean, there doesn't seem to be in principle any reason why that couldn't be the case. And there would always need to be some sort of basic mechanism anyway. The issue is the pairing problem. Why are you paired with this particular body? Which is where I think you have the problem with Cartesian dualism. It's like, well, there's no seemingly essential relationship, whereas in hylomorphic dualism there seems to be, because you have the physical stuff which then is instantiated with the soul, with the sort of rational soul. And so then there's this sort of direct link. And I think also as well, that would then also explain why the physical would affect the mental in a way that it wouldn't explain in the same way as it would in the Cartesian dualism. That's at least my initial thoughts with that. But I think what we've done well here is we have linked this to lots of different areas in that is often not done. And I think one of the issues with a lot of modern philosophy and just general things in life in general, there's a hyper specialization. And so these sort of things aren't brought together in ways that they ought. So I'd now just like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family and subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com.